He claimed her unborn child in front of a silent saloon, but no one knew why. A chair scraped hard across the wooden floor as his voice cut through the room, low and steady. Whiskey stung the air. Every eye turned. She stood frozen, her fingers still caught in a stranger's grip, until he spoke again, closer now, boots thudding slow against the boards. "It's mine." The man let go. The room didn't breathe, and she didn't deny it. "Follow the story and tell me. What would you have done in her place?" The wind came early that day, rolling across Dry Creek like it had somewhere better to be. It carried dust from the hills and laid it over everything. Porches, hats, window ledges, even the tin sign outside Miller's General Store that creaked every time the gusts picked up. Nora Bell Hayes stepped onto the main road with a wicker basket hooked over her arm, damp linens folded inside. The sun sat high but dull, blurred behind a thin veil of grit. Her boots left shallow prints that the wind erased almost as soon as they formed. A man standing by the hitching post stopped talking when she passed. Not mid-sentence, mid-word. The woman beside him followed his gaze, then lowered hers quickly, as if she'd touched something hot. Nora kept walking. The bell over the door at Miller's rang once as she pushed inside. It rang again when the clerk, young, nervous, hair parted too neat, stepped around the counter and moved to the door. He didn't say anything, just held it open. For a moment, the two of them stood there. The smell of flour and tobacco hung between them. "Not today," he muttered, eyes on the floorboards. Nora adjusted the basket on her arm. The damp cloth inside cooled her wrist. She nodded once and stepped back out into the dust. The bell didn't ring that time. Across the street, two women stood close together beneath a striped awning. One leaned in, whispering behind her gloved hand. The other didn't bother hiding it. Her eyes moved, slow and deliberate, stopping at Nora's waist. Nora's dress hung the same as it always had. Still, the glance lingered. "Shame," one of them said, not quite under her breath. Nora walked on. The church door was open. It usually was this hour. Quiet inside. Cooler too. She paused at the threshold, letting the wind pass her before stepping in. A row of women sat near the front. One of them shifted. Just enough. Her skirt pulled inward, leaving a space where Nora might have sat. Nora didn't take it. She moved to the back instead, resting her basket on the last pew. The wood creaked under her weight. A few heads turned. No one spoke. She stayed only a minute, long enough for the silence to settle. Outside again, the wind had picked up. A scrap of newspaper tumbled past her boots, catching against the fence post before lifting again. By the time she reached the iron spur, the sky had taken on that late afternoon color. Thin gold, stretched too far. Hank Dorsey stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, a toothpick working slow between his teeth. He didn't smile when he saw her. "You're early," he said. Nora set the basket down beside the steps. "Thought I'd help with the washing." Hank glanced past her, down the street. A wagon rolled by, driver staring straight ahead like he hadn't seen her at all. Hank lowered his voice. "Might be best you skip tonight." Nora looked at him. "The singing," he added, shifting his weight. "Crowd's been talkin'." From inside, a chair scraped. Laughter followed, sharp and quick. Nora wiped her hands on her skirt, though they weren't dirty. "I always sing Thursdays." Hank nodded, slow. "I know." He didn't move to let her in. A gust of wind pushed through the alley, lifting the edge of her shawl. Somewhere behind her, a man's voice rose, careless and loud. "Don't that tell you everything?" More laughter. Closer now. Nora bent, picked up her basket. The cloth inside had gone cool again, the damp seeping through. She held it a little tighter than before. Hank stepped aside at last, just enough to clear the doorway. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Inside, the room smelled of spilled whiskey and old wood. A fiddle leaned against the stage wall, strings loose. Two men at the far table fell quiet when she entered, then leaned toward each other again, whispering. Nora moved past them without looking. Behind her, the door swung shut. The wind stayed outside, but the dust had already followed her in. She set the basket down near the back wall and stood there a moment, hands resting on the rim. The room hummed low with voices that never quite reached her directly, like they circled instead, always just out of reach. Someone laughed again. Nora didn't turn. She reached into the basket, took out the first piece of cloth, and began to fold it again, though it had already been folded twice. Outside, the wind kept moving, carrying the same story from one end of Dry Creek to the other, faster than any horse could ride. And by the time the sun dipped lower behind the ridge, there wasn't a soul in town who hadn't heard it. Not one. The wind didn't settle when the sun went down. It only changed direction, slipping through the cracks of the iron spur and stirring the smoke above the lamps. The room filled slow, men drifting in with dust on their boots, and the day still clinging to their shoulders. Nora stood near the back wall, fingers resting on the edge of her basket. The fiddle player tightened a string, then another. A chair scraped. Glass met wood. Someone laughed too loud, like they were trying to be heard over something else. Hank wiped down the bar, though it was already clean. He didn't look at her again. "Play something," a man called out. The fiddle answered, thin at first, then fuller. A tune folks knew, easy, something that didn't ask for much. Nora stepped forward when the first verse ended. Not fast, not slow, just the way she always did. The boards beneath her boots had a memory of her weight. She could feel it. The room noticed. Not all at once. One pair of eyes. Then another. She reached for the edge of the small stage and pulled herself up. The lamp beside her flickered, casting a narrow line of light across her face. She opened her mouth. "Hold on there." The voice came from the left, close. A hand caught her wrist. Not rough, not gentle either, just enough to stop her. Nora looked down. The man grinned up at her, hat tipped back, cheeks flushed from whiskey. He pulled lightly, like it was a game. "Reckon folks got questions first," he said, turning his head toward the room. "Ain't that right?" A few chuckles answered him. Someone tapped a glass. Nora didn't pull away. Not yet. "What kind?" she asked. The man stood, keeping hold of her wrist. "Kind that got to do with what you've been carrying around town." A murmur moved through the room. Low, uneasy. Nora's fingers tightened once, then went still. "Let go," she said. He didn't. "Don't see why," he replied. "Whole town's talkin'. Might as well hear it from you." The fiddle went quiet. No one asked it to. It just stopped. Hank set a glass down harder than he meant to. It rang once against the bar, then settled. "Earl," he said, not raising his voice. "That's enough." Earl didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Nora. "Is it true?" he asked. "Or are we all just wasting good talk?" A chair shifted. Boots scraped. The room leaned in without moving closer. Nora looked at the hand on her wrist, then at the faces beyond it. Some curious, some waiting. A few already decided. She drew a breath. "I don't owe you. If she's carrying a child, it's mine." The words came from the doorway. Not loud, not forced. They didn't need to be. They cut through the room like something solid. Earl's grip loosened before he seemed to notice. Nora felt it and pulled her hand back, slow, as if nothing had happened. Every head turned. A man stood just inside the door, dust still on his coat, hat low over his brow. The lamplight caught the edge of his jaw, the line of his shoulder. He hadn't stepped in all the way yet, like he hadn't decided if the room was worth entering. He looked straight at Nora. "Ethan Mercer," someone whispered near the bar. That moved faster than the wind had earlier. Ethan took one step forward, then another. The boards creaked under him the same way they did under anyone else, but no one spoke over it. Earl let out a short laugh. "You jokin'?" Ethan didn't answer him. He stopped a few feet from the stage, close enough that Nora could see the dust caught in the seams of his sleeve, close enough that she could hear his breath, steady, like he'd walked in from a long road and hadn't rushed the last stretch. His eyes didn't leave hers. "You don't have to stand there," he said. It wasn't a command. It wasn't soft either. It was something in between, something that didn't push. Nora stayed where she was. The room waited. Ethan lifted his hand. Not toward her. Just enough that it was there, open, between them. He didn't step closer. Didn't look at anyone else. "Come on," he said. A glass slipped somewhere in the back and hit the floor. No one bent to pick it up. Nora looked at his hand, then at his face. No. There wasn't anything in it she could name. No smile. No edge. Just waiting. She stepped down from the stage. Earl moved aside without being told. The space opened in front of her, narrow and straight. She walked it, one step at a time, the sound of her boots carrying farther than it should have. When she reached him, she didn't take his hand. She passed it. Ethan let it fall back to his side without a word. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Nora followed. Behind them, the room stayed quiet. Not the kind of quiet that ends quickly, the kind that settles in and doesn't know where to go next. The door opened. The wind came in again, colder now. They stepped out into it together. Ethan paused on the porch, long enough to pull a folded paper from his coat pocket and tuck it under a stone by the doorframe. A receipt from the freight office, paid in full. No name written on it. He adjusted his hat and looked out at the dark road. "Horse is tied up back," he said. Nora stood beside him, the dust settling on her shoes again. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he answered. "You don't know anything about what they're saying." He nodded once. "I heard enough." She watched him for a second longer. The lamp behind them flickered, throwing their shadows long across the boards. "And you still said it?" "Yes." A beat passed. Nora pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind tugged at the edge, then let go. "Why?" she asked. Ethan didn't look at her when he answered. "Because it needed saying." He stepped off the porch. After a moment, she did the same. The road out of Dry Creek ran narrow between low scrub and broken fence posts, the kind that leaned like they'd given up holding anything in. Ethan's horse moved steady, hooves striking a rhythm that didn't hurry and didn't slow. Nora walked beside him at first. He didn't tell her to ride, didn't look back to check if she kept up. After a while, he reached down, not touching her, just holding the reins a little shorter so the horse slowed. She noticed, said nothing. When the wind picked up again, she placed one hand on the saddle horn and pulled herself up behind it without asking. He didn't turn. The ranch came into view just as the last of the light drained from the sky. Mercer Ridge stretched wide, more land than Dry Creek could see in a day. A split-rail gate stood half open. One hinge squeaked when the wind caught it. Ethan dismounted first. He tied the horse, then pushed the gate with his boot until it settled into place. Inside, the yard was swept clean. Tools leaned in their places. A bucket sat by the well with a tin dipper hooked on the rim. Nothing looked new, but everything looked used the right way. Nora stepped down on her own. A lantern burned low by the porch. Ethan lifted it, adjusted the wick, and held it just enough to light the doorway. "Room's off the kitchen," he said. "No welcome. No explanation. Just the facts." She stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of coffee grounds and wood smoke. A table stood near the window, 2 chairs, one pushed in, one not. A folded ledger sat open, a pencil resting across the page. Ethan set the lantern down and moved past her, not brushing her shoulder, though there was little space to spare. He opened a door with 2 knuckles, then stepped aside. "Bed's made," he said. "Water's in the basin." Nora looked in. The room was small but kept. A quilt, clean, a chair with a mended back, a nail in the wall with a spare shawl hanging from it. She turned back. "You don't lock your doors?" she asked. Ethan shook his head once. "Not out here." A pause settled. From outside, a horse shifted in the corral. Leather creaked. The wind pressed against the boards, then moved on. "You don't ask questions?" she said. "Not tonight." He crossed to the stove, poured water from a kettle into a tin cup, and set it on the table. Then he pulled another cup down, rinsed it once, and did the same. He left both there. Nora stepped into the small room and set her basket down. She didn't close the door all the way, just enough that it stayed open an inch. The next morning came colder than the night had promised. The ridge held the wind differently. It didn't rush. It stayed. Nora woke to the sound of wood being split. Clean strikes. Even spacing. She sat up, listened, then stood and pulled her shawl tight. In the kitchen, the second cup was gone. The first sat where he'd left it. A thin line of dust gathered along its rim. She stepped onto the porch. Ethan stood near the chopping block, sleeves rolled, axe lifting and falling in a rhythm that didn't waste motion. He didn't look up when she came out. Just finished the cut, set the axe aside, and stacked the split wood against the wall. There was a moment when he might have spoken. He didn't. Nora walked to the well. The rope rasped against the wood as she lowered the bucket. Cold water came up, clear enough to see the grain of the pail beneath it. She poured some into the basin, washed her hands, then her face with Huss. When she turned, he had already gone back inside. By mid-morning, the hands started talking. 2 men near the corral leaned close, voices low but not low enough. "He's lost his sense," one said. "Or he's found trouble," the other answered. Nora carried a stack of folded cloth past them. Neither stopped her. Neither greeted her. She set the cloth on the line and pinned it, 1 piece at a time. The wind pulled at the edges, testing each pin. Near noon, a rider came up the road. Sheriff Luke Braddock didn't hurry his horse. He never did. He rode like a man who expected the ground to wait for him. Ethan stepped out before the horse reached the gate. The 2 men spoke without raising their voices. Nora couldn't hear the words. She didn't try to. She watched the sheriff's hand rest on the horn of his saddle, watched Ethan's stay loose at his sing. After a minute, the sheriff tipped his hat. Not polite, not rude, just enough. He turned his horse and rode back the way he came. The wind picked up again after he left. That afternoon, Nora went inside to set the table. 2 plates, 2 forks. She paused, then added a third and took it away again. A paper lay folded beneath the ledger. She hadn't seen it the night before. She didn't touch it at first, just looked. The edge of a signature showed through the crease. Several, maybe. Ink pressed harder in some places than others. She slid it open. Names. More than she expected. A line at the bottom left blank. She folded it back the way she found it. When Ethan came in, she didn't ask. She set the plates down. He pulled a chair out, then another, leaving space between them. They ate without speaking. At one point, he reached for the salt and stopped, noticing it was already near her hand. He pulled back. She slid it across anyway. Their fingers didn't touch. Later, when the lamps were out and the house had settled into its quiet, Nora stood in the doorway of her room. She looked down the hall. Ethan's door stood open, just like hers. A lantern burned low inside, casting a narrow band of light across the floor. He sat at the table, back to her, pencil moving slow over the ledger. She watched for a moment. Then she pushed her door a little wider. Not all the way. Just enough. The morning came with a dry chill that didn't belong to Arizona. It settled in the boards, in the metal latch on the gate, in the cup left on the table overnight. By noon, word had already reached the ridge. They didn't ride up this time. They gathered in town. Ethan folded the ledger shut, set the pencil across it, and stood. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't ask if she'd come. Nora tied her shawl and stepped out ahead of him. Dry Creek looked smaller in daylight. Or maybe it was the way people stood in clusters now, not moving much, just waiting. The same men from the saloon, the same women from the awning, the same eyes. Sheriff Luke Braddock stood near the well, one hand resting on a folded paper, the other hooked in his belt. He didn't raise his voice when Nora and Ethan walked into the open space. He didn't need to. "Let's clear this up," he said. The wind shifted. Dust moved low along the ground, brushing boots and hems. Sheriff Braddock looked straight at Nora. "No doctor's record," he went on. "No midwife's word. Nothing signed. Nothing seen." He lifted the paper once, then let it fall back against his palm. "She's not carrying a child." It didn't land all at once. It moved through the crowd, changing shape as it went. A man near the hitching post let out a short breath. A woman by the well lowered her hand from her mouth. Then the voices came. So it was a lie. Whole time. Made fools of us. Nora didn't turn her head. She stood where she was, the sound passing over her like wind over dry grass. Ethan said nothing. Sheriff Braddock shifted his weight, letting the silence stretch just long enough. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you made a claim in a public house. Might be time you correct it." Ethan's jaw moved once. He didn't look at the sheriff. "Nothing to correct," he said. A murmur rose, sharper this time. Nora felt it before she saw it. The turn. The same faces. Different angle. She stepped back. No one stopped her. The edge of the crowd opened just enough for her to pass through. She didn't hurry. Didn't slow. The dust clung to the hem of her dress as she crossed the street and kept walking. No one followed. Not at first. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, the ranch sat the same as it had that morning. Gate half set, bucket by the well, the line of cloth still moving with the wind. Nora didn't go inside. She walked past the porch, past the corral, down the narrow path that led to the dry creek bed. Stones shifted under her boots. A brittle branch snapped somewhere to her right. The creek held no water this time of year. Just a shallow cut through the land, edges worn smooth from seasons that had passed. She stepped down into it and stood there. The air felt different away from the house, quieter, like it didn't carry voices as far. She didn't hear him come up behind her. "You left before I could. Why did you lie?" She didn't turn. The question sat between them. Ethan stopped a few feet back, close enough that his shadow reached her boots. Not close enough to touch. For a moment he didn't answer. A hawk circled high above, cutting across the pale sky. "Because no one stood up the last time," he said. Nora's hand tightened around the edge of her shawl. He didn't go on, didn't fill the space. The wind moved along the creek bed, lifting a thin line of dust and setting it down again. "There was someone," he added after a while. Didn't matter what was said. Folks decided anyway. Nora closed her eyes once, then opened them again. "And you couldn't stop it," she said. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence carried the rest. Nora looked down at the ground, at the line her boot had drawn without her noticing. She dragged it once more, then stilled it. "They'll say worse now," she said. "They already are." Another pause. "You don't have to stay," he said. "Never did." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "You made sure of that." He shifted his weight. Gravel moved under his heel. "I made a claim," he said, "not a chain." Nora turned then, not fast, just enough to see him fully. The light had dropped lower, cutting his face into shadow and gold. His hands hung at his sides, open, empty. She searched his face like there might be something written there she hadn't seen before. There wasn't. Just the same steady line, the same quiet. She looked away first, back toward the ridge, toward the house, then down at the creek bed. Her foot moved, one step up the slope, then another. She didn't look back to see if he followed, but she slowed. Just enough. The square in Dry Creek filled before noon. Not loud, not restless. Just people arriving, one by one, as if something had already been decided, and they were there to witness it. Sheriff Luke Braddock stood near the well again, the same place as before, boots planted like he meant to stay there all day. The paper was back in his hand, folded once, creased harder this time. Ethan stepped into the open first. Nora followed, a pace behind, not hiding, not rushing to catch up. The wind moved through the posts and rails, carrying the dry smell of wood and sun. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted weight from one foot to the other. "Mr. Mercer," the sheriff said, voice level, "we're not here for stories. You made a statement. It's time you set it right." Ethan didn't answer. He looked at Nora. Only for a second. Then he faced forward again. "You can stay out of this," he said quietly. Nora shook her head once. "No," she said. She stepped past him. The movement was small, but it changed the way the crowd stood. Heads tilted, eyes followed. She stopped in the open space where the dust had been worn flat by years of boots. The same place Earl had pulled her the night before. The same place the room had waited for her to fall quiet. She didn't. "You needed a lie," she said, voice steady, carrying just enough to decide what I was. No one answered. A wagon creaked somewhere behind the line of people. A horse flicked its tail. Nora kept her eyes forward. "You didn't ask," she went on. "You didn't wait. You just filled in what you didn't know." A woman near the edge of the crowd lowered her gaze. Another looked toward the ground, then back up again. Sheriff Braddock's jaw tightened. "That's enough," he said. "We're talking about order here. About what's proper." Nora turned her head slightly. "Proper," she repeated. The word sat there a moment. Like papers being signed before anyone's seen them? She nodded once toward the sheet in his hand. A murmur moved through the crowd. Softer this time. Curious. The sheriff didn't move. "It's a petition," he said. "Nothing more." "For what?" someone asked from the back. He hesitated. "Not long, but long enough." Ethan stepped forward then. Not past Nora, just beside her. "Read it," he said. The sheriff's fingers pressed harder against the fold. "It's not for public." "Read it," Ethan repeated. The wind picked up, catching the edge of the paper. It fluttered once before the sheriff held it still. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. Then he opened it. The crease split. Names showed first. Lines of them. Ink heavy. Some signatures pressed so hard they had bled through the page. He cleared his throat. "Request for review," he read. "Concerning land use and transfer of ownership under..." He stopped. The words didn't carry the way they had before. Under what? The same voice asked. The sheriff folded the paper again. That's enough, he said. But it wasn't. The space had shifted. People were looking at the paper now. Not at Nora. At the edges. The signatures. The way it had been held back. Who asked for it? Someone said. No answer. Ethan didn't raise his voice. You did, he said. Sheriff Braddock's eyes flicked once. Not at Ethan. At the crowd. It's my job to keep this town in order. By moving people out of it? Nora asked. He didn't look at her. The silence stretched. Not empty. Waiting. Then a woman stepped forward. Slow. Careful. Mrs. Hale, the one who had pulled her skirt away in the church. I didn't sign that, she said. Another voice followed. Neither did I. A man near the hitching post shook his head. I thought it was about water rights. The sheriff's grip tightened. It's all connected, he said. You wouldn't understand. No, Nora said. We do. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. The wind dropped for a moment, like it had moved on to somewhere else. No one clapped. No one cheered. But no one stepped back either. Sheriff Braddock folded the paper smaller this time. Once. Twice. Then he turned. Fine, he said. Have it your way. He walked out of the square without looking back. The space he left didn't close right away. People stayed where they were, looking at each other, at Nora, at Ethan. Then one by one they began to move, not toward them, just away. The square emptied the same way it had filled, quiet, thoughtful. Nora stood there until the last wagon rolled past. Then she turned. Ethan hadn't moved. You don't have to stay, he said. The same words as before. Different now. The dust settled around their boots. The road back to the ridge stretched open, pale and long. Nora reached up and untied the knot at her wrist. The cloth fell loose into her hand, the same one she'd carried through town, through the saloon, through the creek. She looked at it once, then set it down on the edge of the well. She didn't take it with her. Ethan watched, but didn't speak. You can ride? He said. She shook her head. Not yet. They walked out of Dry Creek together. No one called after them. The wind followed for a while, then faded. By the time they reached Mercer Ridge, the light had softened. The gate creaked once as Ethan pushed it open. The same sound as before. Inside, nothing had changed. The bucket still sat by the well. The line still held the last piece of cloth. The door still stood open. Nora stepped onto the porch and paused. Inside, the table held 2 cups. She picked one up, turned it once in her hand, set it back. The room felt different, not quieter. Just hers. The next morning, the wind came again, lighter this time. Nora stepped outside with a strip of white cloth. Not large, just enough to catch. She tied it to the porch rail. It moved with the breeze. Not wild, not still. Ethan stood a few steps back, hands resting at his sides. He didn't ask what it meant. She didn't explain. They watched it a moment. Then she turned and went inside. The door stayed open. Do you want me to continue? There's something about a door left open in a place like that. It doesn't ask you to stay. It doesn't beg you to come back. It just waits. Maybe you've stood in a place like Nora did, where people decided who you were before you ever got the chance to speak, where leaving felt easier than explaining, and staying felt heavier than walking away. And maybe, like her, You wondered what it would take to stand still long enough for the truth to catch up. It wasn't the town that changed that day. Not really. The wind still carried dust. Folks still talked. But something quieter shifted. A woman stopped shrinking herself to fit a story that wasn't hers. And a man chose to stand beside her without trying to own the ground she stood on. Sometimes love doesn't arrive as a promise. Sometimes it shows up as space, as patience, as someone who doesn't reach for you, but doesn't step away either. If you've ever had to choose between leaving and being seen, you know how heavy that moment can feel. Tell me, would you have stayed? There are more stories like this waiting just beyond the next horizon. Stories about people who lost their way, and the quiet roads that led them back. If you feel something in that, you're always welcome to ride along a little farther.